coffee in the garden centre at Inverewe Gardens and ready to go off and explore them. We just started walking around the gardens and I found this beautiful sheltered bench looking down onto the walled gardens, and we've come through the azalea gardens. Of course they're not out now, but what is striking at all the trees and the wind as it sweeps through, and the sound and the power of it, it's really quite extraordinary. It was Osgood Mackenzie from the 1860s onwards who was determined to transform this barren, windswept headland into a unique and beautiful garden. On its latitude, it's closer to the Arctic Circle in St. Petersburg and most of Labrador, and one of the most windswept coastlines in the world. He built his mansion house in the most romantic spot he could find, a bare rocky promontory jutting out into Loch Ewe. He sited his house to look east towards the nearby hills and to the more distant lofty peaks of Torridon. But he also wanted a walled garden to raise fruit, vegetables and flowers. So he started excavating a raised beach beside the sea and building impressive retaining walls and terraces. Now he'd travelled extensively in Europe on the Grand Tour, so he witnessed the Italianate's terraced garden style, which he may have wished to emulate at Inverewe. He died in 1922, and by then Inverewe had become internationally acclaimed as one of the many great plant collections that had developed almost in parallel up and down the west coast of Scotland. He drew plants from all over the temperate world, exploiting behind his newly formed shelter the winter mildness of the coastal fringe, warmed by the North Atlantic drift, the end product of the Gulf Stream. It probably would surprise him that he's remembered almost exclusively as one of the great West Coast garden makers of Britain. And then his daughter, Mairi, overtook on his death in 1922, she took on the responsibility of caring for the garden. Mairi Sawyer, who was the daughter of Osgood, carried on with her father's interests in the garden, and her finest introduction to the garden and a wonderful perennial memorial is a fine specimen of a variegated Turkey oak. We haven't seen that yet, but we will do, to the northeast of the house. And after her husband died, just after the war, she managed to keep the garden together and she was the one who opened its gates to paying visitors for the first time. And she approached the National Trust for Scotland over the possibility of transfer of ownership to ensure the future survival of the garden. And this happened in 1952, and 1 year later she died. The walled garden lies between the drive and the sea, and it was begun shortly after Osgood arrived here by 1870. So he had a raised beach to form an arc around the shoreline, and he built walls to retain the exposed banks and a sloping terrace, so you have this lovely view of the bay. And you know, it's 1 acre, this walled garden is, and he replaced the stones on the shore with a cover of topsoil, and it says here in the book, endless cartloads of peaty stuff from old turf dikes, red soil carted from long distances, and a kind of blue clay marl from below the sea, hauled up at very low tides. So, and then he used seaweed to enrich the soil further, and it was added annually, and they still do it today. And so after he got his soil ready, which is of course you've got to do, as Monty Don said, then he started to plant his garden. He put the fruit trees along the walls, soft fruits, vegetables, and also unusual plants from South Africa. And this is the sunniest part of Inverewe. By the 1880s it was reported as being full of colour and variety, and for Osgood this was Inverewe Garden, the walled garden. For the rest of him it was the woodlands. The American garden, Mairi Sawyer made this open sunny area by her father's eucalyptus trees, very much hers. So the American garden was called that by Osgood Mackenzie because of the American plants he grew here. But Mairi Sawyer made it very much hers. It seems more Japanese now because there are tight mounds of alpine rhododendrons and lovely shape and foliage of Japanese maples. And there's a variegated turkey oak on the lower American garden, where it's one of the garden's rarest trees and arguably the finest in the world. And this was planted by Mairi Sawyer in 1937. Bamboozle, a difficult word to say, and this part of the garden was called this because Osgood planted a circle of bamboos, and there was a maze of paths, and that's why it's called Bamboozle. Now the maze of paths remains, but nearly all the original bamboos have flowered and died. And then there's very fine eucalyptus trees, and also the handkerchief tree beneath one of them. And in the upper part of Bamboozle, where it's sheltered from the wind and salt damage, very fine tree ferns are growing from southeastern Australia. The maze-like quality gives the area a great sense of mystery and the atmosphere of primitive woodland. This is the Eucalyptus gunnii. It is probably the oldest one of its species in the British Isles, one of the tallest, and its trunk is still beautifully slim, with the roots gracefully buttressing out. This area is sheltered from the salt winds, and here we have a fine specimen of an orange-barked Chilean myrtle tree. We've just come up the Devil's Elbow, where there were sweetly scented trees, and now we're looking down over the pond with the water lilies in flower.